Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us on this digital lecture. I apologize for taking a little while to get this lecture up. The reason is that I didn't do it yet. So apologies, I hope you haven't been waiting at the edge of your seat, but I will do my best to make it as interesting as possible. So today we're talking about Babylon.
The spoils of Babylon.
Babylon is a city-state that you have all probably heard of, at least to some extent. You may have heard of, for example, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This is a structure that was listed by the Greek chronicler Herodotus as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Babylon itself is associated with all kinds of things in the biblical canon. It's associated with decadence and the worship of idols. Part of that is almost certainly because the elites of Judea, the Hebrew peoples, the elites of the Hebrew peoples, spent a number of decades as basically as hostages in Babylon itself, in the city of Babylon. They were brought there by King Nebuchadnezzar II.
This is my ship, the Nebuchadnezzar,
who we will certainly talk about in the course of this lecture. But first, what is Babylon? Where is it? The city of Babylon is located in what is today the country of Iraq, the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, so this is sort of the southeastern end of Mesopotamia. And initially, the city is not a particularly fancy place. It's not a particularly powerful state for most of its existence. It starts out as a pretty modest port city. And thanks to a couple of very powerful, very prominent, very charismatic, and very influential kings, Babylon ends up expanding to conquer much of Mesopotamia and become one of the preeminent powers of the ancient world, one of the superpowers, really, one of the great empires of the ancient world, along with Egypt, along with the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which we will talk about in this class very soon. So Babylon was founded even before the very first empire of Mesopotamia came into existence. So the empire of Sargon of Akkad, the world's first empire that we're aware of, is very, very, very ancient in its origins. The first mention of the city comes from an Akkadian source. The inscriptions of King Sharkali-Shari during the time of the Akkadian Empire record that 2 temples were built in the city of Babylon. The patron of the city eventually becomes the god Marduk, who we've talked about in this class already. As I said, initially this is a small and prosperous port city, which had some trouble with its rivals. It was, after all, in a fairly tough neighborhood to be a city-state. So a rival city-state called Kazalu, which we don't really know where this actually was. I mean, it was located somewhere in Mesopotamia, but its precise location is a matter of debate, conquered the city at some point. Now, we know this because we know of a chieftain or king of a people called the Amorites, who boasts of having liberated Babylon from the rule of Kazalu. This Amorite king was named Sumabom, and it was his successor that founded Babylon's first dynasty around 1880 BCE. So this roughly corresponds, for those of you keeping score at home, with basically the high point of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, okay? Now, the Amorites, we should take a minor detour, are a nomadic group of people, very likely originating from the area of modern-day Syria, sometime around 2000 BCE. This group is very prominent. It shows up in a lot of texts. It is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, for example, and it almost certainly exerted a very, very large cultural influence on the lands of Canaan, as well as the lands of the north, the Hittite kingdoms, and certainly on Babylon, as we will see. So Sumabum establishes a dynasty in Babylon. The sixth of his successors is a gentleman by the name of Hammurabi. Now, you may have heard of Hammurabi. In fact, if you've heard of anyone from Babylon, it's very likely to have been Hammurabi. The reason that we know his name is that we associate him with something commonly known as Hammurabi's Code, or the Code of Hammurabi. This is not actually the world's first legal code, but it does make a number of advancements in the application of the law, in the use of evidence, in the application of the law to all peoples, regardless of class. So Hammurabi ruled in Babylon from about 1792 BCE until 1750 BCE. During that time, he was an extraordinarily successful king and an extraordinarily successful conqueror. He succeeded in conquering most of Babylon's rival city-states in the area and securing for Babylon a very large empire that really comprised all of southern Mesopotamia and even parts of Assyria to the north. We'll talk about the Assyrians in a moment. Now, Hammurabi was known by this title, Bani Matem, which is builder of the land, and he well earned this title. Hammurabi demonstrated exceptional administrative, diplomatic, and strategic skill. He ensured his own popularity with the peoples that he conquered, mainly by doing something that was not unprecedented, but perhaps unprecedented at the scale at which Hammurabi practiced it, which was he canceled all debts in his domains. Now remember, in the ancient world, debt slavery was the primary form of indentured servitude, of slavery that existed. So the cancellation of debts was an enormous and somewhat radical step to take, which amounted to a kind of emancipation proclamation. All of a sudden, if everyone's debts were canceled, then the slaves of the region were free. Now, in his first 5 years, Hammurabi restored the Temple of Marduk, okay, as I said, the patron deity of Babylon. He also serviced the other gods of the city and of the cities he conquered. After one imagines securing the favor of the people and of the priests, he launched a series of military campaigns, very successful ones. He led campaigns against neighboring city-states, including the cities of Larsa, Elam, Mari, and importantly, Assyria. And the Assyrians, perhaps more than anyone, take this rather hard. He was also a very skilled diplomat. He would often make alliances with a group, or with a city-state or a kingdom. And frankly, when that alliance no longer served him, he would break it, make an alliance with that kingdom's enemies, and conquer his former ally. Elsewhere, he maintained alliances, but he essentially made sure that the alliance that he created was a somewhat one-sided one. And through this system of alliances and conquests, he took Babylon from a relatively insignificant city to being really the center of the first empire that had included all of Mesopotamia. Among the tactics that Hammurabi he's also famous for weaponizing water in the region, something that actually the area that is today Babylon still experiences to this day. For example, when he conquered the city of Eshnunna, he did so by damming up the rivers that flowed into the city and essentially depriving the residents of water. The crops died, they themselves were threatened with dying of thirst, and this tactic succeeded. Above all, Hammurabi came to be beloved by his subjects because he took pains to care especially for the lower classes of society. This was fairly uncommon in among kingship, or within the practice of kingship in the ancient world. Usually kings spent their time, cultivating relationships with the very powerful, attending to the needs and wishes of the people in their court, perhaps of the high priests, perhaps of regional governors, but they didn't concern themselves with the affairs of slaves and everyday laborers and things like that. But Hammurabi did. He built canals, he redistributed wealth and food to people of lower status, and of course he instituted his famous law code, which importantly applied equally to high and lowborn alike. So we'll talk for a moment about the Code of Hammurabi. The prelude to the law code goes like this. When the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Baal, lord of heaven and earth, he who determines the destiny of the land, committed the rule of all mankind to Marduk, when they pronounced the lofty name of Babylon, when they made it famous among the quarters of the world, and in its midst established an everlasting kingdom, whose foundations were firm as heaven and earth. At that time, Anu and Baal called me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, the worshipper of the gods, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, to enlighten the land, and to further the welfare of the people. Hammurabi, the governor named by Baal, am I, who brought about plenty and abundance. So clearly, Hammurabi thinks somewhat highly of himself. That's not uncommon. But importantly, he sees himself as somebody continuing a tradition begun by the gods themselves of justice, right? And not just meting out justice in terms of revenge, but in terms of caring for the welfare of the people. What made this code unique was not that it was the very first of its kind, okay? It was in fact based largely on an earlier code, the Code of Ur-Nammu, which we think was written sometime between 2100 and 2050 BCE. But Hammurabi's code made significant legal innovations. And these innovations reflected the profound changes that had taken place in the region over the interceding couple hundred years. And it spoke to the challenges of what was then a really entirely new social landscape. It had a diverse and multi-ethnic society, that is, Babylon did, after its conquests in the region. Now, in earlier times, so during the Sumerian Akkadian era, for the most part, there was a widely accepted set of social values and cultural norms, which were undergirded by a shared religious cosmology, a shared general sense of how the world had began, which gods had done it, what their purpose was, etc. And this helped, intergroup relations and interpersonal relations to really transcend simple political divisions, in the sense that people had a general understanding of how to behave towards one another. There was a certain understanding of what was and was not taboo. Practices were similarly respected and understood, etc. But over a period of centuries, with innovations like the wheel, for example, the chariot, roads, manufactured goods that were traded in larger and larger quantities, as well as migrations such that speakers of various West Semitic languages, like the Amorites, for example, found themselves regularly interacting with, trading with, intermarrying, for example, speakers of North Semitic, like Akkadian. And these different groups found that they had different understandings of what the gods wanted. It wasn't so easy to simply find common ground, a common understanding of how justice was to be enacted. So Hammurabi's code set standards by which groups that perhaps did not share exactly the same understanding of the universe, of the gods, of the world itself, could nonetheless come to some sort of understanding about what justice entailed. And it did this by setting standards of evidence. So to our knowledge, this is really the first major legal code to do this. Someone had to be found to be guilty of a crime. Now, the way that they were found to be guilty of a crime, was not like a CSI DNA sample by any means. Very often it involved something like an ordeal. That is to say, someone would be thrown into a river, and if they drowned, it meant that they were clearly guilty, that kind of thing. It also tried to codify and include specific fines for just about every property crime that Hammurabi or his scribes could think of, as well as, a system of equal punishments, especially for violent crimes, for just about all infractions that anyone could theorize. So, to show you a little bit of how this works, I'll give you an example from the code. The code states, if one person blinds another, their own eye shall be blinded in retribution. You've probably heard the phrase, an eye for an eye. If someone fractures the bone of another, their own bone shall be fractured in return. When a man causes the loss of another's teeth, his own teeth shall suffer a similar fate. Should a builder undertake the construction of a house for another and fails to complete it properly, and the house he erected collapses, resulting in the death of the homeowner, then the builder shall be put to death. If the house collapses and causes the death of the owner's son, the builder's own son shall likewise be subject to the penalty of death. So this is a fairly harsh system of laws, but what is important is that it is understandable, and people know what to expect when they do something or don't do something that infringes on the livelihood, the bodily integrity, the rights of another. So, what happened to our friend Hammurabi? Well, unfortunately, as was often the case in the ancient world, when Hammurabi died, his empire quickly collapsed. Despite the legal code that endeared Hammurabi to his subjects, it seemed that sense of demotion did not carry over to whoever inherited the government thereafter. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that there was something defective or deficient about the system of laws or the governance structure that was in place. Simply that it's important to remember the idea of continuity of government was not a concept that really touched most of the ancient world, with the possible exception of in Egyptian society. That is to say, people understood their allegiance, their responsibilities and obligations to extend, in some cases, to a king, in some cases even to a foreign king. But once that king was gone, they did not have allegiance necessarily to some idea of Babylon, right? They did not have a sense of allegiance to the idea of the Code of Hammurabi, as much as they may have appreciated having such a code while he lived. So without the builder of the land, the empire was riven by both external threats and internal strife. The Hittites, who we really haven't touched on in this class, and unfortunately won't have time to get into much detail about them, but which were a civilization, a sort of a warrior civilization in some respects, based in what is today central Turkey. The Hittites managed to sack Babylon in 1531 BCE. And this marks the end of what we call the Old Babylonian period. Subsequently, a group called the Kassites, which were a Mesopotamian culture whose exact origin we don't know. Their existence is attested to in ancient documents, They're mentioned, but we don't know much about their origins. We do know, however, that they took over Babylon and began what is called the Kassite dynasty, which lasted for a period of about 400 years, from the 1500s BCE to the 1100s BCE. But the Kassite dynasty then fell to a group called the Assyrians. And the Assyrians installed their own king in Babylon. Now, at this point, we are into the first millennium BCE, which is to say we are no longer dealing in millennia before Christ, before the Common Era, but instead we are dealing with a matter of centuries. And it's important to keep that time scale in mind, okay? So until this point, often when we've been talking about groups and cultures and dynasties, we're talking in matters of, chunks of hundreds of years. Now we're talking about chunks of decades, and sometimes. So the Assyrians found Babylon rather hard to govern. The city persistently and repeatedly rebelled against the Assyrian kings, and this sufficiently annoyed King Sennacherib that in 689 he ordered the complete destruction of the city. However, the city had become a very important cult center, especially to the god Marduk. And so this was seen as sacrilege, as a desecration of holy space. So much so that Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons, who justified their action as a retribution for the sacrilege committed against Babylon. It's important also to remember that Babylon is, in many cases, the lens that we read ancient Sumeria through. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, the version of that epic that we have is not, for the most part, directly from Akkadian, but from translations and transcriptions from Babylon, okay? So Babylon is this center of learning, it's a center of religious devotion, but it is the place that many of the cultural traditions of Sumeria, of Akkadia, and of the ancient Mesopotamian are preserved. So when we try to get at what those earlier cultures were thinking and doing, it's important to always remember that we're mostly, the sources that we have are the Babylonians' interpretation or transcription of those events and those peoples, okay? And that subtly changes how we understand the sources that we have. Under the rule of the Assyrian Ashurbanipal, Babylon solidified its reputation, this reputation that it had as the sort of the center of learning and of cultural production in Mesopotamia. Now, as Assyrian power declined in Babylon and in the region more generally, their rule was replaced by what is called the Chaldean dynasty, named for their possible and plausible origin in the nearby city of Kaldu at the time. So a dynasty, this Chaldean dynasty, emerges from this place and begins what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So you have Old Babylon, Hammurabi. New Babylon is associated especially with the second of the Chaldean kings, Nebuchadnezzar II.
This is my ship, the Nebuchadnezzar. But
Nebuchadnezzar embarked on extensive renovations of the city of Babylon. He expanded the city to cover over 2,200 acres, and he erected some of Mesopotamia's most magnificent structures, indeed some of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world. These include the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which no longer exist. We don't know exactly how they looked, but they are attested to in the ancient sources, their existence. And the Ishtar Gate, which we do have some sense of how it looked, and in fact reconstructions of it that exist in Iraq, but also in the Pergamon Museum in Germany. And it's easy to imagine, if you are a foreigner and you're entering the city of Babylon, having to pass through this massive blue Ishtar gate, probably one of the largest structures you have ever seen, and is decorated in this gorgeous sort of lapis styling, it would have been quite a sight. Now here is this is just an artist representation, but gives a sense of how the fabled Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have looked. In any case, creating this sort of botanical garden in the ancient world was no small feat, and demonstrates not only an extraordinary and advanced knowledge of botany, but also irrigation technologies, construction techniques that would have been very difficult to mimic in just about any other place. Now, the age of the Neo-Babylonian Empire continues until a character that we're going to meet in the next class, the Achaemenid Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, conquers the city of Babylon. This really marks the end of Babylon as an independent and major power in the region. Thereafter, the folks who visit Babylon, who write about Babylon, are basically writing about a time that has already passed. Okay, so when we read about Babylon in a lot of the ancient sources, many of which are Greek, especially the Greek chronicler Herodotus, we're reading a text that is rooted in nostalgia. Now, the Persian army defeated the Babylonians at Opis, which is a site east of the Tigris River, in 539. Cyrus entered Babylon, and there he began to style himself as a traditional Mesopotamian monarch, even though his Persian or Median, or if you like, Aryan culture was quite different, actually, than Babylonian culture or society. Nonetheless, he embraced the kind of syncretism that rule over Babylon engendered. And it was Cyrus who let the political captives in Babylon go. And among these are, of course, importantly, our friends, the Judeans / Israelites, who were allowed under Cyrus to return to their home in Judea, and he even contributed some money that they could rebuild their temple. So for many of the peoples of the Middle East, especially the sort of oppressed, the kind of minority ethnic groups, Cyrus was understood as a liberator, and that, in a lot of ways, is exactly the reputation that he sought to cultivate. So next class, we'll talk more about the Persians and more about Cyrus. And by the end of that class, we will talk about the way that the Persians, in a lot of ways, are responsible for the emergence of Greek culture on the world stage.